The Westworld mobile game is no longer available for download on Google Play Store and the iOS Store as of January 15th, and on April, the game will be completely shutting down. While the reasons for this are vague, and basically we're moving to other projects, that's all we have to say at the moment, is pretty dang vague. A lot of fans are actually speculating this has to do with a Bethesda lawsuit that happened back in June, I believe. And this basically means that because of this lawsuit that actually settled outside of court, they are no longer able to run the game, either for financial reasons, this giving, them more reason to actually shut down the game because it can't be financially supported because of whatever settlement they went to, or because Bethesda's basically told them to stop running the game. We don't necessarily know because we don't have an official statement, but it's fun to speculate. Michael here with another topic video. So if you're not familiar with this whole scenario to where Bethesda was actually suing both the publisher and developer of the Westworld mobile game, which was Warner Bros. And Behavior Interactive, I believe. Sorry, I can't really remember their name all the time. I'm terrible with that. But essentially, they were suing them because not only did the Westworld game look almost exactly like Fallout Shelter and play exactly like Fallout Shelter, I mean, literally from an outside standpoint, if you looked at those games, you would assume they are the exact same game, just with like a different, skin or something like that. And while that may not be actually, suable or anything like that, this is really, really common on mobile, and you can actually copy art styles and stuff like that. People can have similar art styles. That's not illegal. However, what is illegal is using code that you do not own. And so what Bethesda was actually proposing at the time is that because of certain bugs and because of the visual style, because of every mechanic in the game being pretty much exactly the same, they were alleging that the game actually copied code from Fallout Shelter. And given that Behavior Interactive actually developed both of these games, it actually wouldn't be outside of reason that they had the code left over and decided to try and use it to save on time and money. Given Warner Bros., they normally don't give a lot of time for companies to develop these games, so it honestly wouldn't surprise me, and I don't blame them for this. However, you can't actually use code that you do not own. And while some people would be like, oh, well, they developed the game, so they own the code, right? This actually isn't the case, depending on your contract. Most of the time, what ends up happening is when a company actually hires you to make some code, they're buying the code from you. That's normally part of the agreement. And therefore, when it came down to this specific case, obviously Bethesda is a company that would buy the code. They're not going to deal with anything that isn't them buying the code, because they want to own pretty much absolutely everything. That's what large companies do. So yeah, basically they had a case here, and a lot of people were wondering like, oh, well, they could have just been common libraries or something along those lines. And for one, for a game like this that has such a similar art style and such a similar gameplay structure, I seriously doubt it. Yes, there are other mobile games, and this type of mobile game is definitely popular, which if you've never played it, it's basically there's a bunch of rooms, you set up rooms, and they do stuff, and you hire people to go inside rooms, and they build up resources on passive moments and stuff like that, which, again, that's popular in mobile. However, given the similarities, Bethesda knew what they were doing. They knew that this was actually similar, and the reason why the lawsuit actually started to begin with was actually some of the bugs that were seen in the original Westworld game. Apparently, some of these bugs were actually seen in early versions of the Fallout Shelter game, which meant that they immediately had some evidence that actually went into this claim as well. So essentially, given that the lawsuit actually settled outside of court, it kind of proved the point that this was actually true, as in they did end up using code from Fallout Shelter. And while the developer may not have had bad intentions, I mean, it just makes sense, quite frankly, from a development standpoint. If you have the code, just freaking use it sort of thing. But they didn't check whether they actually owned said code or not, and that just kind of screwed them over in the end. Now, I don't know what the settlement actually was. No one really does, and no one actually knows if it is a financial reasoning or if it is actually just them telling them to shut down. Now, with a lot of these types of games, when you end up buying servers and things like that, I was literally just talking about this yesterday when it came down to Orcs Must Die shutting down, the Unchained free-to-play version of it. And basically, when you actually, pay for servers, you have a contract and you have a limitation to where it's like, oh, it's going to last this amount of time, and this is when it will shut down. Now, my speculation is that it would actually be related to this sort of scenario, to where basically Bethesda may have been like, okay, we want you to stop running the game, but we understand that you have all these contracts and stuff like that. We'll let you finish out the contracts, but because we don't want to pay for that. Because somebody would have to pay for the contracts ending, and I think Bethesda was probably understanding on that standpoint. As for as outlandishly as that sounds, Bethesda has been in this scenario before, so they probably know what they're doing and they know how to get what they want. And so given this scenario, they probably did something along those lines, and that's why we're just now seeing it shut down. And companies are not going to announce, when they can still make money off of you, that they're shutting down their game in 8 months or whatever, because these contracts normally last 12 months-ish or something like that. Sometimes they're multiple years, but those cases would be pretty rare. So yeah, basically I think that's why it is shutting down. But of course it could also be financial reasoning. Now, Bethesda could have easily said, like, hey, well, since you're using some of our code, we want part of the cut. And so they could have been like, oh, well, you owe us 60%. And then all of a sudden, the company not only wants, again, this would tie down to the contracts, but essentially they could be like, all right, we don't want to be associated with Bethesda, or maybe they can no longer financially support it. And so basically once their contracts are up, they're like, all right, cool, let's just shut it down. Who cares? You know, because it's just done and over with. I've never seen those balloons before, and I'm curious if you can pop them. Oh my God, you can explode them. That is fantastic. Sorry, I got distracted for a moment. Yeah, so that could also be a case to where basically just financially they couldn't support the game if they were doing this, or maybe they weren't making the profit that they wanted to, which is another common scenario because, again, these large companies, this is Warner Bros. After all. This was a microtransaction-laden hellhole, quite frankly. Very similar to Fallout Shelter. In fact, they actually copied that element quite well, as in it was quite a lot of microtransactions and randomized loot boxes. So if they were looking for that, unfortunately, it no longer exists, but that's okay, because there's 1,001 of them on mobile. If you want to find other ones, there's better ones out there. But yeah, so this also means that Fallout Shelter is still going to exist, and they weren't really running into any problems when it comes down to this. So yeah, so basically, if you want a game like this, Fallout Shelter still exists, but the Westworld game will no longer exist. And the reasoning given is pretty vague, but essentially people are speculating that that's the reason why. It's just that the lawsuit went through, and they didn't want to deal with it, basically. And I mean, they could have obviously fought it harder, but it never actually went to court. And it actually went out of court is what had this thing with prejudice. I don't know. Essentially, it was in a scenario to where it wouldn't come back out of court. And so they couldn't be like, oh, well, we want to bring this back up. It wasn't going to be able to go through there. So basically, that's why people were assuming that this was over with and that the game would actually continue running. But I think the reason why it ended that way, I have never seen this castle before. I'm in a part of the map I've never been to. I'm so happy for that. So most likely the reason why it actually settled out of court and was like, hey, this will never come back to court is because Bethesda was like, hey, we're done with this. Your game's going to shut down. And that might have been the scenario from the entire time, quite frankly. And we necessarily will never know because I don't think they'll ever make an official announcement. We might find out in a few years when then one of the developers slips a tongue or something like that. But yeah, I don't know. And whether or not to be sad about it, I don't know. I don't know how many people were actually playing it, and I don't know if any gamers were playing it either. I don't know how popular it was. It doesn't seem like it was doing too financially terrible, which is why I'm not necessarily talking about, you know, the financial stability of these types of games, because quite frankly, the Westworld IP, where was that, the collectible? The Westworld IP is big enough that I easily could have seen it just doing extremely well for pretty much nothing, and just having absolutely no problem functioning whatsoever, even on minimal resources. And these types of games are not expensive to run. Indies run these types of games all the freaking time, and they run fairly successful, even with little to no players. So I don't think that's the actual reasoning for it to shut down. But again, you know, lawsuits, they kind of suck. And whether or not people are going to be mad about this, people have actually argued the point of whether Bethesda actually owns the code. And quite frankly, we don't really have a say in that. It all comes down to the contracts that people end up writing. And so when Behavior Interactive actually went through with this, they're probably learning a lesson, as in when they sign contracts, they should probably make sure that they own the code if they actually want to use it in future projects. And it kind of sucks because they were kind of baited into this, quite frankly, getting in my personal opinions of this. I feel like they were kind of baited into this because, again, we're talking about large corporations kind of hiring a small developer. Small developer is like, hey, we built Fallout Shelter and we're really proud of it. And then, you know, another publisher's like, hey, we want a cut of that pie. Can you do the same exact thing and just do it with our IP instead? And they're like, oh, sure, yay, we're getting money and we're actually being hired. And then all of a sudden it's like, oh, now we're being sued by our previous employer. So yeah, I feel like they were kind of baited into it. So if you want to like talk about ethics and things like that, I feel like it just super sucks. But it's also on, you know, Behavior Interactive to check whether they own that and stuff. And honestly, I blame this whole thing on kind of, you know, sorry. I almost said Westworld Interactive, Warner Bros. Entertainment, because basically they're kind of the ones that wanted a very similar game, and they asked for this specifically, and I feel like they're the ones that kind of baited it forward, and I feel like they just sort of accepted that it was a clone of it, which is kind of something you never really want to do. But again, this is something that publishers do all the time, and again, copying the art style and copying the feeling and gameplay mechanics isn't illegal, so yeah, I don't know. I feel bad for Behavior Interactive. I don't know anything about them, so they could be assholes, and I could just be speaking out of line. But Yeah, there you go. So if you're wondering on my personal opinions, I think it sucks, but I also agree with it. You know, watch your contracts. If you're a developer kind of listening to this, watch your contracts. Make sure you own your code. Make sure you always own your code. And make sure you own your own IPs, because otherwise you'll find out your previous employer is going to be suing your new employer and you in the process. Anyways, thank you guys so much for watching. Make sure to like and subscribe for more content like this one. And of course, you can leave your thoughts and comments below. If there's anything I missed, you can also leave it in thoughts and comments. Sorry I dragged on a little bit. I kind of rambled here and there. But I don't really necessarily know what to say about this topic, quite frankly, so I was kind of trying harder to figure stuff out, but whatever. And of course, if you like my styles of content, you can check out my website at michaelpstanich.com, a link in the description, and you can join our gaming Discord, code the book and chat box. We talk about stuff. It's getting an overhaul in a few days, so if you're interested in that, you can end up checking it out. And of course, if you see other news topics that you want me to cover in the future, make sure to throw them my way. And that actually goes into the Discord as well. We have a news section that will be getting an overhaul, so any sort of news stories that I end up finding will be inside that news section, and I will be kind of basically posting stuff there, and sometimes I'll cover them, sometimes I won't. So if you want to stay up to date on the stuff that I'm looking and thinking about covering, you can end up checking that out as well. Anyways, thank you guys so much for watching, and I'm going to explore some more in Sunset Overdrive, which is the game I'm playing. I mean, I would play the Westworld game, but it no longer downloadable. Honestly, I wouldn't play it, to be honest. I wouldn't even play Fallout Shelter. Not a very good game.